Welcome to Faded Truths History. This is the story of the Bloody Benders, America's first serial killer family. The Bloody Benders. The last thing William York's family received was a letter. He was riding alone through Kansas in the spring of 1873, a respected doctor heading home. He never arrived. No body, no horse, no explanation. Just silence where a man used to be. He wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last. For nearly 2 years, travelers had been vanishing along a lonely stretch of road in southeastern Kansas. Men setting out on routine journeys, never completing them. Families filed reports. Sheriffs shrugged. This was the frontier, after all. People disappear. The land is vast. The winters are brutal. But William York's brother refused to accept that answer. He rode out himself, asking questions at every farm and homestead along the route. One name kept coming up. A small inn about a mile off the main road. A family called the Benders. Friendly people, locals said. The daughter was charming. They sold groceries, cooked meals, offered a bed for the night. A perfect place to stop. A perfect place to disappear. In April of 1873, a search party rode to the Benders' homestead. The door was swinging open in the wind. The family was gone. But beneath a small apple orchard beside the cabin, the earth was soft, sunken, wrong. They grabbed shovels. What they found beneath the ground would shock the entire nation. Bodies, one after another. Skulls caved in, throats cut, buried like secrets in the dark Kansas soil. Inside the cabin, a curtain dividing the room, a trap door beneath it, a blood-soaked hammer, and walls so dark with dried blood they looked painted. A mother, a father, a son, a daughter. A killing machine disguised as a family business, operating in plain sight for nearly 2 years on the American frontier. They murdered at least 11 people, possibly more. And then, they simply vanished. No arrest, no trial, no punishment. To this day, no one knows where they went or what became of them. Who were the Benders? To understand what happened on that lonely stretch of Kansas road, you first have to understand the world the Benders chose to hide in, the early 1870s. The American frontier was exploding. The Homestead Act of 1862 had thrown open millions of acres of land to anyone brave, or desperate, enough to claim it. Settlers poured westward in waves. Farmers, dreamers, former soldiers, immigrants who barely spoke English, men with nothing left to lose. The roads through Kansas were constantly alive with wagon trains, lone riders, and traveling merchants moving between towns that barely existed yet. It was a world without surveillance, without telegraphs on every corner, without any real law enforcement outside of city limits. A man could ride into the Kansas prairie and simply cease to exist. Nobody would think twice. Nobody would come looking. Not right away. Not soon enough. The Benders understood this perfectly. They arrived in Labette County, Kansas, sometime around 1870. 4 of them. Strangers to the county, but not strangers to each other, though even that would later be called into question. John Bender Sr. was a large, physically imposing man in his 60s. Broad shoulders, thick hands, a face like a closed door. He spoke broken English and communicated mostly in grunts. Locals who met him described an uneasy feeling they couldn't quite name. Not aggression exactly, but something hollow behind the eyes. A man who looked through you rather than at you. He worked the land, tended the horses, and stayed out of conversations. He didn't need to be charming. That wasn't his job. His wife, known only as Ma Bender, was arguably the most frightening of the 4. Heavy-set, sharp-featured, with a stillness about her that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. She rarely smiled. When she did, it didn't reach her eyes. Neighbors who visited the inn recalled feeling watched, even when her back was turned. One local woman later said she visited the Bender cabin once for supplies and left so unsettled she never returned. She couldn't explain it. She just knew something in that house was wrong. John Bender Jr. was quieter still. In his 20s, awkward, prone to sudden, strange laughter at moments that didn't call for it. He drifted around the property, doing chores, avoiding eye contact. Some locals thought he was simple. Others thought he was performing simplicity. Either way, he left people cold. And then there was Kate. Kate Bender was everything the rest of her family was not. She was in her mid-20s, bright-eyed, quick with a smile, confident in a way that frontier women rarely were allowed to be. She spoke fluent English with barely a trace of the German accent that plagued the rest of her family. She was educated, or at least appeared to be. She held opinions. She argued them. She laughed at the right moments and listened with her full attention when men spoke to her, which, on the lonely frontier, was practically intoxicating. She also advertised herself as a spiritual healer and psychic medium. She distributed handbills in nearby towns offering seances, healing sessions, and communications with the dead. People came. They paid. They left feeling they'd encountered something extraordinary. Kate Bender was, by every account, the kind of person who made you feel like the most important soul in the room. This was not an accident. Kate was the lure. The human face on a family that, behind closed doors, had no human face at all. The family's cabin sat along the main trail connecting Cherryvale and Thayer, a well-traveled route for settlers, merchants, and anyone crossing southeastern Kansas. They registered it as an inn and grocery store, one of dozens along the route, nothing unusual. A hand-painted sign, a hitching post. The smell of cooked food drifting out through the door. Weary travelers stopped. Of course they did. Inside, the cabin was a single room, sparse, functional, unremarkable, except for one thing. Stretched across the middle of the room was a large canvas wagon cover, hung ceiling to floor, dividing the space in two. On the front side, the public side, sat a rough wooden dining table with a bench pressed hard against the curtain. Guests were always seated with their backs to the canvas. Always. It was presented as simply the way things were arranged. Space was tight, the family needed privacy, nothing to think about. Nobody thought about it. On the other side of that curtain, darkness, and whoever was waiting in it. The routine was devastatingly simple, and it worked because it was built on trust. A traveler arrives, tired from the road. Kate greets him at the door, warm, attentive, interested. She shows him to the table. Food is served. Conversation flows. The man relaxes. His guard drops completely. Why wouldn't it? He's inside a home. There's a woman smiling across the table. There's the smell of bread. There's the sound of wind outside and warmth inside. He never hears what's coming. A hammer swung hard through the canvas from behind. One blow to the back of the skull. Precise. Practiced. Delivered by either Old John or John Jr., waiting in perfect silence on the other side of that curtain. The trapdoor beneath the table dropped directly into a cellar below. The body fell. The throat was cut down there, to make certain. Then, under cover of night, the Benders carried their victim out to the small apple orchard beside the cabin and buried them in the dark Kansas soil. By morning, the table was clean. The curtain hung still. Kate was already smiling at the road, watching for the next rider. Consider for a moment a man named Benjamin Brown. He passed through Labette County in the winter of 1872. A farmer traveling alone to finalize a land purchase 2 counties over. He carried a modest amount of cash, enough to complete the deal. He stopped at the Bender Inn for a meal and a night's rest. He was never seen again. His family waited, wrote letters, filed a report with local authorities. They were told the frontier was dangerous. These things happen. His land deal was never completed. His family never received a single answer. He was one of at least 11, possibly more, because the Benders were not careless. They chose solitary travelers when they could, men without local connections, men whose disappearance could be explained away by weather, by bandits, by bad luck, by the brutal indifference of the American West. What makes this story so deeply unsettling is not just the violence, it's the architecture of it. This was not impulsive, not passionate, not the act of desperate, cornered people. This was a system, designed, built, and operated by an entire family in calm, deliberate coordination. Each member had a role. Each role was essential. The father's brute strength, the mother's cold management, the son's silent obedience. And Kate, always Kate, standing at the door, making sure the next victim sat down at that table with a full heart and his back to the curtain. For nearly 2 years, they ran this operation without a single interruption. Travelers came. Travelers disappeared. The Benders smiled and cooked their meals and dug their holes and waited. The frontier swallowed the missing hole, and the Benders just kept digging. The victims. In the winter of 1872, a man named Benjamin Brown saddled his horse before dawn, kissed his wife goodbye, and rode out across the Kansas plain to finalize a land purchase 2 counties over. He carried enough cash to complete the deal. He told his wife he'd be back within the week. She never saw him again. No body, no horse, no letter, no explanation. Just silence. The kind that starts as worry, hardens into dread, and eventually becomes something a family learns to carry forever. Local authorities told her the frontier was dangerous. Men disappear, these things happen. It happened to Benjamin Brown. And it had happened before him. And it would happen again. The Benders did not kill randomly. That is perhaps the most chilling thing about them. They were selective, patient, calculated. They watched the road the way a spider watches a web, without urgency, without panic, with the quiet certainty of something that knows, sooner or later, the right prey will wander in. Their ideal victim followed a clear profile, a lone traveler, a man carrying cash, land deeds, or valuables. Someone passing through, not a local, not someone whose absence would immediately ignite alarm in the surrounding county. Someone the frontier could absorb quietly, the way dry earth absorbs rain, without a trace, without a sound. And the frontier was extraordinarily good at that. The disappearances along the Osage Trail through Labette County had begun as early as late 1871. A traveler fails to arrive. A family waits. A report is filed and promptly forgotten. Law enforcement in southeastern Kansas was thin, underfunded, and stretched across vast distances of empty land. There was no system for connecting the dots between one missing man in one county and another missing man 50 miles away. Each disappearance existed in its own isolated silence. The Benders had read the landscape perfectly. They knew exactly what they were operating inside. Among their confirmed victims were men of all kinds: farmers, merchants, a horse trader, a land speculator. Each one had stopped for a meal. Each one had sat at that table, back to the curtain, full of the ordinary trust that comes from being inside a warm room with people who are smiling at you. William F. McCrotty. A traveler whose body, when eventually recovered from the orchard, showed the now familiar signature, a single catastrophic blow to the back of the skull, the throat cut below. Henry Mackenzie, a farmer heading west, carrying the modest savings of a lifetime. Gone. His family spent years believing he had simply abandoned them. The shame of that false belief outlasted the truth by decades. But it was one specific victim and one specific family that would bring the entire operation crashing down. Dr. William Henry York was not the kind of man who disappeared quietly. He was a physician from Independence, Kansas, respected, well-connected, known across several counties. In March of 1873, he was traveling alone through Labette County, returning home after visiting his brother, Colonel A.M. York, a man of considerable influence and absolutely iron determination. Dr. York stopped at the Bender Inn for a meal and a rest. He was never seen again. The Benders almost certainly recognized the risk the moment he walked through the door. A man like York, known, connected, with a powerful brother who would come looking, was exactly the kind of victim their instincts told them to turn away. But something overrode that caution. Perhaps it was the money he carried. Perhaps it was the arrogance that grows quietly inside people who have killed 11 times without consequence. The slow, dangerous belief that they had become untouchable. They sat him at the table, his back to the curtain, and they killed him the same way they killed everyone else. What they could not have anticipated was the brother. Colonel York arrived in Labette County days later and began his own investigation, methodical, relentless, and utterly indifferent to the shrugs of local law enforcement. He rode from farm to farm, homestead to homestead, asking the same questions with the same quiet intensity. Had anyone seen his brother? Which road? Where did he stop? The name Bender kept coming up. Colonel York rode to the inn himself. He dismounted, walked through the door, and sat across the table from Kate Bender. He asked his questions. She answered them without flinching. Warm, measured, precise. She suggested the doctor had likely been attacked by road bandits somewhere between counties. Terrible things happened on the frontier, she said. Surely the colonel understood that. The colonel understood nothing of the sort. He sat in that room, across from the woman who had almost certainly lured his brother to his death, and he looked at her. And she looked back at him, and neither of them blinked. York left the inn alive. The Benders almost certainly let him go deliberately. Killing a colonel, after already killing the colonel's brother, would bring down a storm that even the Kansas prairie couldn't hide them from. They had miscalculated once already. They would not do it again. But the storm was already forming on the horizon, because Colonel York was not the only one asking questions now. Other families had started comparing notes. Other names had started connecting, and word was spreading through Labette County of a search party being organized. One that would ride out and check every homestead, every property, every inch of that trail. The Benders knew, and before the search party arrived, they ran. But they left something behind that no amount of running could undo. When investigators finally reached the orchard and began to dig, they found what the Kansas earth had been keeping. Body after body, each bearing the same wounds, each buried with the same cold efficiency. 11 confirmed victims, possibly more in graves not yet found. And among them, a detail that turned public grief into something closer to primal rage. A farmer named George Longcore had been traveling through Labette County with his young daughter, a little girl no older than 8 years old. Both were found in the orchard. The father had been killed the usual way. The daughter had not. The evidence suggested she had been alive when she was put into the ground. When that detail reached the newspapers, it spread across the country like fire across dry grass. This was no longer a story about missing travelers. This was something that reached into the deepest, most unguarded human instinct, the trust we place in a warm light in a dark window, the smell of a cooked meal, the smile of a stranger at the door. The Benders had taken the sacred, unspoken code of frontier hospitality, the ancient understanding that a traveler in need will be sheltered, will be fed, will be safe, and they had turned it into the most efficient killing machine the American West had ever seen. 11 people walked willingly through that door. None of them walked back out. The unraveling. By the spring of 1873, the silence along the Osage Trail had grown too loud to ignore. It wasn't just one family asking questions anymore. It wasn't just Colonel York riding from farm to farm with that cold, quiet fury behind his eyes. Across Labette County, people had begun to talk to each other, comparing notes, connecting names, counting absences. A cattle dealer who never arrived. A preacher who vanished between towns. A farmer and his little girl who set out one morning and were never heard from again. The numbers didn't add up, and the people of southeastern Kansas were done pretending they did. In early April of 1873, a large committee of local settlers organized a formal search party. Dozens of men, armed, mounted, and methodical. Their plan was straightforward: ride the full length of the Osage Trail and inspect every single property along it. Every homestead, every inn, every barn. No exceptions, no courtesies. If you lived along that road, your land was going to be searched. The Benders knew it was coming. Exactly how they found out has never been established with certainty. Perhaps word reached them through a passing traveler. Perhaps Kate, with her wide network of clients and acquaintances from her spiritualist work, picked up the whispers moving through the county. Perhaps old John simply looked out across the prairie one morning and read the horizon, the way men who have something to hide learn to read it, with a specific animal alertness that has nothing to do with reason and everything to do with survival. However they learned it, they moved fast. When the search party arrived at the Bender homestead on the morning of April 3, 1873, they found the cabin standing open and empty. No family, no horses, no wagon. The fire in the stove had gone cold. The food on the shelf was untouched, as though the Benders had simply stood up from whatever they were doing and walked out the door without looking back. The men stepped inside. The smell hit them first. That particular smell, iron and rot and something older, something that gets into the back of the throat and stays there, told them everything before their eyes caught up. They pulled back the canvas curtain. They found the trapdoor. They went down into the cellar and found the dark, soaked earth below. Then they went outside to the small apple orchard that sat innocent and green beside the cabin. They pushed shovels into the ground. Within hours, they had found 8 bodies. Eventually, the count would reach 11 confirmed victims, with the possibility of more in ground that was never fully excavated. Each bore the same signature, that single devastating blow to the skull, the throat cut below. The Benders had not improvised. They had not experimented. They had found a method, and they had applied it with the consistency of people running a business. Because that is exactly what it was, a business. And now the owners had fled. Colonel York, who had been riding with the search party, stood at the edge of that orchard and looked at what the earth had given back. Somewhere in those graves was his brother. He had known it before the first shovel broke the ground. He had known it since the moment he sat across from Kate Bender and watched her smile without her eyes moving. He said nothing. He remounted his horse, and he rode hard toward the nearest telegraph station. Within 24 hours, the story was on the wire. Within 48, it had reached newspapers across the country. The Bloody Benders. The name appeared almost immediately, as though the press had been waiting for exactly this kind of story, were front-page news from Kansas City to New York. The details that emerged from that orchard, and especially the detail about the little girl buried alive, ignited a public fury unlike anything the frontier had produced before. The governor of Kansas offered a reward, then raised it. Vigilante groups formed overnight, riding out in every direction with no particular plan beyond the bone-deep desire to find these 4 people before the law did. And the pursuit began. It was, by any measure, one of the largest manhunts in American history to that point. Reports came in from across the country. Sightings in Missouri, in Texas, in Indian Territory, in Michigan. Each lead was chased. Each lead dissolved. The Benders had vanished into the vast American interior as completely and efficiently as their victims had vanished into the Kansas soil. 2 women were arrested in Michigan in 1889, 16 years after the disappearance, on the suspicion of being Ma Bender and Kate. The case attracted enormous national attention. Survivors who had known the family were brought in to identify them. The testimonies were contradictory and inconclusive. The women were eventually released. Whether they were the Benders or simply 2 unlucky women caught in the machinery of a panicked manhunt, nobody could say for certain. A former sheriff named Dick Almonds claimed years later that a posse had caught up with the Benders not long after their disappearance, that justice had been delivered quietly, extrajudicially, somewhere out in the dark Kansas countryside where no paperwork was required. He described it in broad terms, with the satisfaction of a man recounting something he considered finished. But he never provided names, never provided proof, and the claim was never verified. Others insisted the family had crossed into Indian Territory and disappeared among the displaced populations moving through that lawless corridor. Others said they had taken a train east, changed their names, and lived out ordinary lives in ordinary towns. Neighbors to people who would have recoiled in horror had they known who was living next door. Kate Bender, some believed, had made it to Europe. None of it was ever confirmed. What the investigation did confirm was the scale of what the Benders had built and the audacity with which they had operated it. Forensic examination of the cabin revealed that the cellar had been used repeatedly over an extended period. The volume of blood soaked into the earthen floor indicated far more activity than 11 victims could account for. Some historians believe the true number of Bender victims may never be known, that the orchard gave up only what the search party happened to dig in, and that the Kansas plain still holds the rest. The cabin itself became an immediate landmark. Within days of the discovery, people were riding out from nearby towns just to stand in front of it, to look at the curtain, to sit at the table briefly and then stand up very quickly. Pieces of the cabin were taken as souvenirs, a particularly American instinct, the need to possess a fragment of the terrible. The structure was eventually torn down, but the site itself drew visitors for years, as though the ground carried something that couldn't be demolished. It did, of course. It carried the dead. And it carried the unanswered question that would follow this case for the next century and a half. The question that no reward money, no manhunt, no arrest, no confession ever resolved. The vanishing. There is a particular kind of horror that has nothing to do with what you find. It has everything to do with what you don't. The bodies were found. The cabin was examined. The hammer was recovered. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, and complete. Every piece of the puzzle was on the table, except the 4 people who had assembled it. The Benders had walked off the edge of the known world, and the known world had no idea how to get them back. The manhunt that followed was unlike anything the American frontier had seen. The governor of Kansas posted a reward, $200 per Bender, a significant sum in 1873. It was raised, then raised again. Vigilante groups rode out in every direction, fueled by outrage and the particular frontier justice that doesn't wait for courtrooms. Sheriffs sent telegrams across state lines. Newspapers printed descriptions. The name Bloody Benders was on every front page from Kansas City to Boston. And still, nothing. The trail went cold almost immediately, as though the 4 of them had simply ceased to exist the moment they crossed the county line. In the weeks following the discovery, reported sightings came pouring in from across the country. Missouri, Texas, Colorado, Indian Territory. Each one was chased. Each one evaporated upon examination. The Benders were everywhere and nowhere. A family of 4 ghosts drifting through a country too vast and too chaotic to pin them down. Then the theories began. The first and most persistent theory was the one that gave the most people the most comfort, that the Benders had been caught. Not by the law, by the other kind of justice, the kind that rides out after dark and doesn't file paperwork. For years, rumors circulated through Labette County that a vigilante posse had tracked the family down not long after their disappearance, somewhere in the open country south of the Kansas border, and had delivered the verdict that the courts never got the chance to. Several men, speaking privately and in old age, claimed knowledge of what had happened. One former lawman described it in terms that left little to the imagination, with the quiet satisfaction of someone describing a thing he considered finished and correct. But no names were ever given, no graves were ever found, no confession was ever signed. If the posse caught them, they took the secret to their own graves with a discipline that rivaled the Benders' own. The second theory arrived 16 years later, in 1889, and briefly convinced the entire country that the case was solved. 2 women were arrested in Detroit, Michigan, a mother and daughter traveling under assumed names, behaving suspiciously, and bearing what witnesses described as a striking resemblance to Ma Bender and Kate. The arrest made headlines overnight. Survivors from Labette County were brought to Detroit to make identifications. The courtroom was packed. The country held its breath. And then, it fell apart. The testimonies contradicted each other. Some witnesses were certain. Others were certain in the opposite direction. The women themselves maintained their innocence with a composure that either proved they were innocent or proved they were exactly who everyone feared they were. The case collapsed under the weight of its own uncertainty. The women were released. Whether they were the Benders or simply 2 unlucky women devoured by a hungry manhunt, the historical record cannot say. Kate Bender, some investigators believed, had gone further, much further. There were credible reports, credible enough to be taken seriously, not credible enough to be confirmed, that she had crossed the Atlantic. That she was living somewhere in Europe, possibly Germany, possibly under a married name, possibly growing old in a village where nobody had ever heard of Labette County, or the Osage Trail, or a hammer swung through a canvas curtain in the dark. The image is almost unbearable. Kate Bender, magnetic, charming, fluent, adaptable, was precisely the kind of person who could disappear into a new identity and make it look effortless. She had spent years performing warmth she didn't feel, performing normalcy over a cellar full of the dead. Reinventing herself for a new audience would have been, for Kate, the easiest thing in the world. John Jr. was rumored to have drifted into Indian Territory, the lawless corridor between Kansas and Texas where identities went to dissolve and men with reasons to disappear found neighbors who asked no questions. Old John and Ma Bender, slower, older, less adaptable, their fate is the most uncertain of all. Some accounts suggest they didn't make it far, that the road, or the weather, or the men riding behind them caught up with the eldest Benders before the younger ones. None of it verified. All of it haunting. What the case left behind was something more durable than any arrest could have provided. A question. Open, permanent, and unanswerable. A question that has outlasted everyone who lived through the original events, outlasted the cabin, outlasted the orchard, outlasted the graves themselves. The Bender case was never officially closed. It exists in the records of Labette County as an open investigation, technically, legally, formally unsolved. No arrest, no trial, no verdict. 4 people committed at least 11 murders in cold blood, in plain sight over nearly 2 years, and then walked away from it completely. In the century and a half since, researchers have returned to the case repeatedly. Books have been written, documentaries produced. Genealogists have traced family trees looking for branches that might connect to the Bender name. In 2023, a forensic historian claimed to have identified possible descendants living in the Midwest. People who had no idea what their ancestors had done, living ordinary lives in ordinary towns, the blood of the Benders running quiet and undetected through perfectly unremarkable families. The land where the cabin stood is still there, flat, open, windswept. There is no monument, no marker, no memorial to the 11 people who were buried in that orchard. The Kansas plain doesn't hold on to things the way cities do. It just holds on to the wind and the grass and the silence. But if you drive out along the old Osage Trail on a gray April morning, the kind of morning the search party rode out on in 1873, and you stop the car and get out and stand there in that flat, enormous landscape, you feel something that is difficult to name precisely. It is the feeling of a question that was never answered. It is the feeling of 4 people still out there, somewhere, having gotten away with it. It is the feeling, irrational, persistent, and completely understandable, that the frontier didn't just swallow their victims, it swallowed them too, and kept all of them, forever.